we
Welcome to today's episode of the Highway 64 podcast from Murphy to Manteo. The Highway 64 project is a collaboration between Elon University's Professional Writing and Rhetoric program and the Environmental Studies Department to explore the local intricacies of culture, community, and climate resiliency along Highway 64 in North Carolina. Highway 64, running from the mountains to the ocean, is our North Carolina Heritage Highway and serves as a metaphor that represents the rich geographical, cultural, ecological diversity that is our state. My name is Olivia Love, and I am the producer of the podcast and a researcher on our team. Our guest for today is Corey Davis, an assistant state climatologist at the North Carolina State Climate Office and editor of the North Carolina Climate Blog. Today's conversation will focus on climatology in North Carolina and the importance of utilizing climate resources to understand how climate change affects you. With me today is Dr. Michael Strickland, Caden Hallberg, and Michaela Shapiro, but I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Caden Hallberg, and I've been working with the project for multiple years. I run the website right now, and I've been on multiple other podcasts. I'm always interested in learning more about climate resiliency and environmental advocacy, so this is going to be a very fun podcast, I'm sure.
I'm Michaela Shapiro. I've been working on the project since the fall. I'm one of the E&S people doing research, and I'm interested to see how people's attitudes on climate have shifted over time and how that can be kind of curbed with the right resources.
And I'm Michael Strickland. I teach both in Professional Writing and Rhetoric Department and Environmental Studies, and I'm the director of the Center for Environmental Studies and oversee the Highway 64 project. We are really happy to have Corey Davis here, assistant climatologist from the North Carolina State Climate Office. I know Corey studied meteorology and atmospheric science at NC State, but I'll let him, I think some of our questions are going to give him the opportunity to give us a little more background and how he got to this place doing this very critical work these days. So let's go ahead and get started.
Yeah, so I wanted to know what first drew you to climatology and how did that path lead you to becoming North Carolina's assistant state climatologist?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me. I'll say this is a dangerous question because this opens up to telling my life stories, so I'll try to keep this a little bit short. I was born in North Carolina. I've lived in North Carolina my whole life, and I feel like I've always had that connection or interest in the weather. When I was 2 years old, we had tornadoes that tore through Forsyth County, where I'm from, and then later that year we had Hurricane Hugo. That was the worst hurricane to hit western North Carolina up until Helene. So going through those experiences, even though I was too young to remember those storms, I would grow up hearing the stories and watching the old home videos on VHS tapes about what those did to our neighborhood and our community, and that made me interested in learning more about weather and what makes storms like that tick. So as a kid, I would follow the hurricanes, I would pick up a tracking chart at the grocery store every summer, and even if I went outside to play with my friends, I would make sure to get back in the house before the Weather Channel's tropical update so I could get the latest coordinates for the storms. And that really describes the relationship that I had with weather as a kid. It was a hobby of mine. I had never thought about making it a career until finally I applied to college. I had been accepted to NC State University, and I saw they had a meteorology program, so I thought that sounded interesting. I went there, and the first day in class, we were contouring weather maps. So again, it's just like a childhood dream come true.
Yeah.
All through college, I had hoped to eventually be on TV, be a broadcast meteorologist. I'll say the economy was not in great shape when I graduated in 2008 or 2009.
Oof.
Fortunately, I had a backup plan. I had already joined the state climate office by then as a student intern. We were working on projects like developing severe weather training material for emergency managers. And they kept me around at the climate office. I was hired on full-time in 2014. And I've come to realize that lets me do the things I've always been interested about weather, which is making nice visualizations and communicating and telling the story of our weather with folks all across the state. So at this point, I have been at the climate office in some capacity for almost 18 years and as a staff member now since 2014.
Man, Corey, I remember those hurricane tracking charts you got from the grocery store. That was so much fun. Why don't they do that anymore with little kids?
You know, I think everything has gone digital now. You can go on weather.com or the National Hurricane Center, and they've got a very accurate chart.
Okay.
But, I think that takes some of the magic away of plotting those points yourself. Especially some of the big storms that moved into North Carolina, like I remember Bertha and Fran when I was a kid.
Yeah.
You would see those points getting closer and closer to the coast and really made you realize that these are not just points on a map. These are actual events that have impacts on our state.
Yeah. Yeah, I think handling the old analog maps was just a different kind of experience. That was cool stuff.
It is. And I'll say One nice thing about being at the climate office, we share our building with the National Weather Service office in Raleigh, and they do that same exercise every shift. They are hand contouring weather maps. Again, that's their way to make sure they're staying in touch with the weather
Right.
and those actual patterns and not just points and numbers on a map.
Very cool.
Well, yeah, a lot of what you've just been talking about is like educating the public. I guess our next question is just what misunderstandings about weather and climate do you encounter most in your professional role? Like, what exactly do you come across? Do you find yourself repeating most often?
I feel like in a lot of cases, it's just people confusing weather and climate, and I should probably elaborate what I mean about that. I usually describe climate as what we expect, while weather is what we actually get. And of course,
Uh,
climate is based on long term averages. This is usually a 30-year average of the weather on any day or any month. So we know those tend to be pretty steady over time. Weather, though, varies from day to day, even from hour to hour, so it changes a lot. The example I like to give of this is if I ask someone, do we expect snow? The answer is the wintertime. Now, that does not mean every day of the winter will be snowy, and that does not mean every winter will have snow. Of course, we've seen in recent years several winters that we didn't have any, but again, that describes that difference. But I think where we start to see people get into trouble is sometimes done with good intentions. They're trying to explain and understand the weather around them. So, the last 5 years, we have slipped into drought during the fall. And one thing I've heard then is people will say, October is a dry month for us anyway. And that's true, but usually October will have something like 3 to 4 inches of rain. These recent years, we've had 1 inch in October. So they're right that it's dry, but it's not that dry. And then I think, unfortunately, we also see cases where people will purposefully confuse these with an agenda in
right.
mind. The most common example is when it snows, like it did this winter, they'll come in and say, oh, so much for that climate change. And of course, the problem there is that we've never said with climate change it will never snow again, but we know that climate change, because of the warming temperatures and changing weather patterns, that does mean the odds of events like snow have shifted. And even after we saw a foot of snow this winter, that did not significantly change those background snow totals. If we look over the last 30 years, we still see that places like Charlotte have had their average annual snowfall cut in half. So even one big snow does not disprove climate change and the overall trends. And again, I think it's unfortunate that sometimes people will purposely try to confuse by using that weather versus climate distinction.
Yeah, I hear that a lot from people. I like the fact that you said often with a misinformation or disinformation agenda
Mhm.
involved. I mean, you see things like, people in the Senate in Washington, D.C., bringing in a snowball saying, this is from my home state. This climate change is a hoax because clearly this disproves it. And I think that filters down to the average everyday person, but they will say, yeah, I don't believe climate change. I don't trust the scientist. But my grandmother says, the dogwoods are blooming 2 weeks earlier than they used to, and we don't have near as much snow as we did when my mother was a little girl. Those kinds of personal notes, I think, give people the information that makes them, feel the tension between what they are told by certain people and what they feel like they ought to believe, and then what they're personally experiencing.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That's what I've noticed as well. When you talk to people across the state, even if they don't use the term climate change or global warming, they recognize that we are seeing changes and our weather acts differently today than it did 20 or 30 or 50 years ago. It reminds me of a quote from a good atmospheric science, Dr. Kerry Emanuel from MIT, said that in his experience, it's not that people distrust the science, they distrust the solution. So, because this has become such a political topic, they think that taking action against climate change has to mean big government and things that they may not like, things that I don't necessarily like a lot of those answers. But again, I think when you really talk to people, they will say, yeah, we don't see as much snow now as we did 30 years ago. We see the springs warming more than they did 30 years ago. We see the weather just acting crazier and being more unpredictable. So I think a lot of folks will acknowledge that. And that's fine if that's the level that they're at.
On that note, connected up with that, you already answered some stuff about the drought, and I know you've been very busy with drought issues. And I know for at least, what information I'm gathering for the classes that I teach about agriculture and gardening and things, that this is one of the driest spring starts that we've ever had. My commute in through the country, giant fields that normally will be almost knee high in corn and soybeans right now are crispy brown, nothing planted, or what was planted has died. Could you kind of put into context just how bad this drought is this spring that we've been in, like you say, since the fall?
Yeah, I think this is alarming for a lot of folks because it has been almost 20 years now since we have been this
Yeah.
dry in North Carolina. I was thinking the other day, I was a college student when we had the 2008 drought. I remember being in the dorms when they replaced the shower heads with low flow fixtures and we were asked to help conserve water. But that was long enough ago that most of today's college freshmen and sophomores weren't even
Yeah.
alive when that drought happened.
Yeah.
So, I think that tells us something about how our recent climate has looked. We have been predominantly wet over those last 15 years or so. And I say that we're lucky in that, and you might think that sounds strange because look at the weather we have had over those last 15 years. It's a lot of big hurricanes. It's storms like Florence at the coast and Helene in the mountains and even Chantal here across central North Carolina. So that doesn't mean we've avoided the worst of weather hazards, but it just means we haven't had to deal with a drought like this one in quite a while.
Well, I remember that '07, '08 drought so clearly in my mind, and I tell students about driving around in neighborhoods where there were watering bans on your yard, and you would see crispy brown yards and all of a sudden one jade green yard and those people would get fined and they would just keep on doing it. I remember dairy farmers' wells running dry and then having to truck in water to keep their dairy herds alive. It was really scary stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And, looking back at not just the 2007 drought, but some of the other big droughts over the last 100 years or so, we see a lot of those same things. We were just looking this week at the 1925 and 26 drought. So that was a full century ago.
Yeah.
And you saw the same thing. It was people getting fined. At that point, it was $50 if they started a fire outside. Of course, $50 then is about $900
Right.
today. So that was more than just a slap on the wrist. But also, we saw some misconceptions back then, just like now. We've had a couple minor rain events over the last week, no more than a quarter to half inch, but people are seriously asking us, does that mean the drought is over? And you're right, this drought is not just a current event. This dates back more than 6 months to the fall. So we know that the rainfall deficits of more than 12 inches that have built up over that time will not go away in one night, in one rain event, even in 1 month. And again, that is a big change from what we're used to, where recent droughts have been shorter lived. They can emerge quickly, especially when we have some hot and dry weather, but often it only takes a couple rains to really tamp those back down. Again, that is a definite change, and this is reminding us of one of those parts of our climate that a lot of folks had forgotten about or have never experienced, but extreme, long-lasting droughts like this do historically
Yeah.
happen at least every 15 to 20
Okay.
years.
That's a really good thing to keep in mind. Yeah.
I was just going to say we've been talking about the droughts and just we kind of just started talking about some of the side effects of the droughts, how there's fires and things like that. And I just wanted to ask you because when we were doing background into research into you, we noticed that you created like a couple of online portals, including the Fire Weather Intelligence portal. And so, just as a climatologist and a web developer, what makes a climate website actually engaging as well as useful for the public instead of just informative?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad you noted that work that we've done with North Carolina Forest Service. This dates back almost 15 years at this point, so they have been a great partner for our office and helped encourage and support us for doing work like that. I'll mention that the State Climate Office is a public service center for the state of North Carolina. Usually that means that as people have questions about weather or climate, or want to know how weather or climate affects them, or if they know their vulnerabilities, how they can make better decisions, we try to use our data and our expertise to help them solve those questions and make those decisions. So really, I treat the sort of web development that we do as an extension of our science communication work. It's all about presenting information in a way that helps people understand the data and make those better decisions. For me, a lot of that centers around good visualizations. Now, I won't name any names here, but there are lots of websites out there that are very rich in data, but just don't do the presentation justice. It's just a wall of text or a big data
Mhm.
table. And most people, including myself, can't look at that and just absorb what that means and what it tells us about what the weather is doing or how that affects them. And I find that a lot of the best visuals are ones that add context. And I think that's something we're very well positioned to do at the Climate Office, knowing the historical data that we have available. One great example of that, I think, in the fire weather portal is that when you're looking at fire danger conditions, you can see not just what the forecast is for tomorrow, but you can see the range of conditions that we've seen on that day of the year historically. You
Mm.
can know if we're near the highest risk level or near the average, and then how that is changing over the last week or month or even years. So I think another big piece of designing good websites is listening to your audience. That was the case when we first started building this fire weather portal almost 15 years ago. We worked with our partners at the Forest Service to find out what they actually wanted and not what we thought they wanted. We did the same thing when we redesigned our data retrieval tool called Cardinal a few years ago. We went to workshops where we talked to extension agents who actually use that to pull data to inform farmers in their areas, and they gave us a wish list of what they were
Mhm.
looking for, and we tried to incorporate those things in the tools. So I think, in that sense, we're fortunate at the Climate Office to have people that have a wide range of skill sets. There's people that have that eye for design. There's people who know how to manage that underlying data, and the people who can go out and do that one-on-one engagement and training for these tools. And I think that's why they've been so successful.
Corey, who do you keep track of your web traffic? Is it mostly professionals and agriculturalists and people like that using it? My gut tells me the general public doesn't know much about you guys even existing.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you go back historically, well before I started the Climate Office, the agriculture sector was the main one that we served. And we've been lucky to have a great relationship with agriculture in North Carolina. They have helped support us in the development of tools like this. They have helped us equip our weather stations with soil moisture sensors and leaf wetness sensors, things that help them better monitor and understand what's happening in their fields. And then as time goes on, we've added new partners like the Forest Service for fire weather monitoring, the Department of Transportation for precipitation monitoring. So in that sense, a lot of the information on our website, the tools that we build are geared towards specific audiences. But then in things like our climate blog and then some of the general data products that we have, those are focused for the general public. So we have done a better job of getting more average folks across North Carolina aware of what we are, what we do, and then the data that we have.
I really like how you mentioned graphics and how it's such a great way for like the general public to easily interpret scientific data because I've had a lot of conversations recently where there's a lot of great graphics out there, but people just don't know that they're out there. And I just wanted to ask that if someone in North Carolina wanted to better understand the changing climate in the place they live in, what's the main things you'd encourage them to pay attention to?
I think with climate change, temperatures get a lot of attention, but in a lot of cases, those can be tougher to notice. We talked about the difference between weather and climate. There's so much day-to-day variability in our temperatures as is that it can be harder to pick up on a long-term trend. For instance, during the winter months, we've seen a warming trend of about a degree or a degree and a half per decade in our temperatures, but that's the difference between 32 degrees and 33 or 34 degrees at night. Not something that you'll really notice that easily. I think what can be more noticeable with temperatures are things like when we get out of season warmth, when it's 80 degrees in February or 90 degrees in March, like we had in
Mhm.
places like Fayetteville just last month. And then the other big changes I think we've noticed are with our precipitation patterns. They're just getting more extreme, more unpredictable. You can see the wet days are getting wetter. In between those wetter periods, we're getting longer dry spells and faster emerging droughts. Especially if you talk to a farmer or somebody who maintains a garden, they will definitely tell you that has been a change even over the last 5 to 10 years. We're not getting that rainfall at the regular intervals like we did in the past. It is heavier when it falls, like literally when it rains, it pours. And then these dry stretches just seem like they will go on for longer. It's even drier. We've had 3 weeks in a row now in April without rain in parts of North Carolina. So that's another example of these changing patterns that I think a lot of folks are starting to pay attention to.
Yeah, those are the two things. You mentioned two of the things that strike me most as just a resident of North Carolina, somebody who grew up on a farm and somebody who gardens in multiple spaces. Uh, is the droughts which really, really scare me. That summer of '07, '08, that was just that's the kind of stuff that kept you up at night, worrying when and you see old movies or television shows about rainmakers out west and crops dying and people in the town hiring somebody to come and try to make it rain. And it really becomes, it seems weird to watch that on a movie, but it makes sense when you start experiencing it. But the other one that I try to explain to people and they don't quite get it is that rainfall intensity you're talking about. When I was young, a heavy rainstorm on a summer afternoon might drop inch and a half of rain. Nowadays, 2.5, 3 inches of rain is not unusual for an afternoon thunderstorm front coming through. And that just freaks me out a little bit.
Yeah, and we saw a great example of that just last summer in the Elon area. We know the first week of July, we had Tropical Storm Chantal that came through. First off, it's worth noting that those were extreme precipitation totals. We saw 8 to 10 inches of rain in a 12-hour period in some spots, just far beyond anything we had seen historically. So that's one sign of a change. But then we looked at what happened over the next few weeks. We had a very moist atmosphere. There was lots of water that was still on the ground and in the rivers that was available to turn into new clouds and more rain. And we were seeing just about every day, somewhere in Alamance or Orange County, was getting another 2 to 3 inch rainfall. So that's the kind of effect that climate change is having. It's really supercharging our atmosphere with moisture, making it easier for us to get those heavy rain events when we're in a wet pattern. And then when we're in a dry pattern like we are now, you're right, it seems helpless sometimes. You want somebody to be able to conjure up some rainfall. And, in recent weeks, we just
Yeah,
haven't seen
I
a
was
lot of
really
that.
disappointed last night watching my local weather meteorologist talking about the possibility of getting some this morning, and then waking up this morning, walking the dogs, and looking at the map, and it was all going into Virginia rather than over us.
Yeah, those are frustrating times when you can see the
You
rain
know it's
on the
out there.
radar and they just
Yeah,
seem to go around. Yeah, and that's why we're seeing that degrading drought across especially central North Carolina over these last few weeks. We have just consistently missed out on even those small amounts of rain that places to our north or to our
yeah.
east are picking up
And
on.
that episode with Chantal and the rains afterwards is so vivid in my memory. I have friends who live in Saxbahaw, and the Haw River got up over the bridge, tore out, people's houses. The people who lived on the first floor of the apartments in the old mill there were flooded out. The school, the post office, devastating stuff.
And I mentioned that growing up, I would watch storms like Fran that affected North Carolina. If you had told me back in 1996 that the record river levels from Fran would be
Yeah,
exceeded one day, I would have said even then that would surely be a
yeah.
Category 5 storm because Fran seemed like it was as bad as it gets. And remember when Chantal came
Oh
through
yeah,
last summer, it was only a
yeah,
tropical depression
right.
over North Carolina. So again, that speaks to really the changing nature of impacts from hurricanes. We know that wind and storm surge can still be problems, but in recent years, it's been those weaker but slow moving storms that just brought in tons of moisture that have caused more of those flooding issues even
Yeah.
further
Yeah, I
inland.
was on the coast of South Carolina when Chantal came ashore over us, and the impact down there was minimal. Then I drove back up here, and it was devastating in Alamance and Orange counties.
Right, and we've seen that more than once. You go back the year before, we had
Yeah,
Tropical Storm Debbie
yeah,
that did the same thing. It sat and spun its wheels off the South Carolina coast as a minimal tropical storm, but while it was down there, it's picking up that moisture off the Atlantic, and then it created flooding as far west as Charlotte. And of course, we know what happened the next month. That was when
right.
Helene moved through western North Carolina. So we're continuing to see these bad storms that affect us in maybe non traditional ways. It's not the Cat 3 at the coast that we have to worry about anymore. It's big rainmakers and flood makers that are moving
I
further
think that
inland.
that's another example of how climatologists and meteorologists have done an interesting, good job of connecting with people in the whole tracking storms and putting them in their categories. But the way we categorize tropical storms is really a blunt instrument. It's all about wind speeds, right? And the devastation
Right.
from Cat 5 is a Cat 5. It's just bad any way you look at it. But Cat 2s and Cat 3s can be devastating depending on what kind of storm surge they bring with them or what kind of rain, things like that. I wonder if we don't need to rethink the way we classify our storms.
That's really been a great lesson learned from some of the big hurricanes that we've had over these last 10 years. Talking with some of the Weather Service meteorologists down at the coast, they mentioned that
Yeah,
Hurricane Florence was once a Category 4, and then it started weakening as it got close to the coast. It ended up making landfall as just a low end hurricane, but at the same time, they realized that while the winds were going down, the flood
yeah,
potential was going up because Florence was slowing down. So that was a challenge in messaging. They had to make folks realize that the threat was not over from Florence, even though it was a weaker storm. If anything, it would be more impactful with the rain. We saw the same thing with Hurricane
yes,
Matthew. This was a storm that never
yeah,
actually made landfall
yeah.
in North Carolina, but because it passed so close to the coastline and had so much moisture at its disposal, it still created intense rainfall amounts well inland. So, areas that thought they were out of the woods because it would not be a landfalling storm ended up seeing some of the heaviest flooding, like down
Was
in Lumberton.
Florence the one that flooded I-9?
Yeah, both of those did, but Florence especially closed dozens of miles of I-95 and I-40 down at the coast for several weeks before they
Yeah, I
could
don't
get
know if
those
you guys can
reopened.
imagine this in your brains, but when the floodwaters from Florence receded after flooding out like Corey said, dozens of miles of 95. Highways were covered with dead fish, and they had to bring bulldozers out and bulldoze the highway clean because you couldn't drive on it because of all the muck and debris and dead fish. It was crazy. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And
That's
I'll give a small
crazy.
plug for our office. We work closely with the North Carolina Department of Transportation in the aftermath of those big storms that caused that widespread flooding, even on some of the bridges through Lumberton. They realized that they
Yeah.
need to update their engineering designs so that if a storm like that happens in the future, and we expect it will at some point, that they're not dealing with the same flooding and having to rebuild the same areas. So we've been able to provide them with future precipitation projections showing, even in a worst case scenario by the end of the century, how much rain you might get from heavy events like that. That is directly informing their blueprints for the new roads and bridges in parts of
Yeah,
eastern
that's
North
another
Carolina.
concept that's been blown out of the water by the recent, past couple of decades. It's this whole idea of 100-year storms and 500-year storms. When you have 3 500-year storms in a decade, that kind of throws that label out of the
Yep, that's exactly right. And I think Florence was just, literally the
yeah.
perfect storm in that case. It was off the charts of any rainfall projections, even in a most extreme 1,000-year event. Lumberton saw 30 some inches of rain over the course of 3 days, just far beyond anything they'd seen historically. And I think that, in my experience, was the most eye-opening moment for a lot of people. They realized that climate change is not something we have to worry about 20 years from now. It's affecting us now, and it's really beyond any of the projections that even we had in a worst case scenario.
I've been reading. I haven't been saying much to the students about it because I don't want to give them anything more to worry about. But I've been reading more and more about this idea of a super El Nino developing out in the Pacific. And I think in recent years, we've learned a lot more about the global impact of these kinds of events. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit. And do you think it is as bad as some people are saying, or maybe we're overhyping the El Nino too much because it appears different this year?
Something really interesting about this El Nino phenomenon is that humans have been aware of this for hundreds of years now. That's actually how it got its name. Back in the 17 and 1800s, fishermen along the coast of South America would notice that around Christmas time, the water would start to warm up. That would improve their fishing prospects. So they named the submerging pattern El Nino, or the little boy, because that's the time of year they celebrated a little boy, Jesus. And then it's really only been over the last 7 years or so that we've had good enough observations to understand how these patterns are actually changing and taking shape and evolving from year to year. So that gives us a pretty small sample size. We've only had about 30 El Nino and 30 La Nina events over that time. So that can make it tough to still know how these events tick. For instance, why some years we'll have a back-to-back La Nina. That was the case over the last couple years. And then why some years we will go not just to an El Nino, but a very strong El Nino like this. And now it does seem like climate change is a big contributor, and that's because at their core, these patterns, El Nino and La Nina, are ocean patterns. They describe the warming of water in the Pacific. We know when that warm water sits there for long enough, it has atmospheric impacts. It changes the flow of the jet stream through the atmosphere. We also know that climate change has really had the biggest impact on the oceans. They have absorbed the brunt of the warming, so it makes sense that when we're in that warm phase or El Nino, climate change may give it a little extra boost. And I think that's part of the reason why some of the recent El Ninos, like the one back in 2015, have been even stronger. That may be why this year's is stronger as well. There's lots of other ideas about what makes these events strong. If we look down beneath the ocean surface right now, we see tons of heat that's been stored there and is just
Yeah.
waiting to emerge at the surface. So maybe we're just unlucky in this case. Maybe there's lots of subsurface warmth like we haven't had in the past. But again, it seems hard to separate that from warming that we see due to climate change as well.
Kayla, I'll let you transition from there then, as I ponder all of that Corey just laid on us, because I'm recently becoming very fascinated with that, and the fact that we do have hundreds of years of observation on this
Mhm.
is, to me, historically relevant in ways that I think we're just now coming to understand.
And I'll say that when I was a grad student at NC State,
All
El
right.
Nino was the focus
Okay.
of my master's research. I was looking at how these patterns can lead to better or worse fire
Yeah.
seasons in North Carolina. So there's lots of connections. A lot of people get excited about El Nino because of snowfall chances, but really it means more for things like drought and wildfires than it does for anything. So lots
The
of
thing that fascinates
applications
me
there.
most, and I think makes me feel a little bit better because I know there are lots of other downsides to it, is that it appears to put something of a damper in the hurricane corridor in the South Atlantic, which means for where my family lives down on the coast of South Carolina, a little less worrisome about storm season, which puts fear in everybody's heart down there.
Right. Yeah, we usually see in these El Nino events that the upper level winds, especially in the jet stream, will strengthen. That adds more wind shear across the Atlantic, so that does tend to hold down activity. One thing I'm watching is that the water is still very warm in the Atlantic going into this season, so I think we could see more early season activity. And we know historically, early season storms like to set up right along the Carolina coast, so that may mean we avoid hurricanes this year, but we may not
Right.
avoid all
Although,
tropical
if we
impacts.
try to make lemonade out of this, a low impact tropical storm moving up the coast and dropping 10 inches of rain might be a good thing for our drought.
That's right. We like to say that the best
Yeah.
cure for a drought is a good hurricane. Not sure if we want a hurricane, but yeah, one of those storms that were to sit and spin its wheels for a couple days and drop a solid
Yeah.
rain, that would help, especially
Yeah.
with as dry as it is right now.
And seeing the difference in hurricanes, my family lives in Florida, so definitely how all this is going to impact is definitely good to know. My question for you is a little different, not really related to anything we've talked about, but that's okay. So last week we had Catherine Hay-Ho here as our Earth Day speaker, and her key message was to communicate with others about climate concerns and to try to be positive and find common ground with those who seem to have different perspectives. Do you just have any thoughts or comments on that?
I mentioned a minute ago that Hurricane Florence was such an extreme event, and I think because of that, that really changed some attitudes toward climate change. Again, this took it from being one of those
Yeah.
future problems to a now problem. And even folks who you might not expect would talk about climate change were asking questions, and that was especially the farmers. Remember, by the
Yeah.
time Florence
Yeah.
came through, they had already seen flooding from Hurricane Floyd in 1999, from Hurricane Matthew in 2016. Florence was the third event that they had been told was a 1,000-year storm that they had seen in a
Mhm.
20-year period. A lot of these farmers are working on lands that their families have owned and used for farming for many years. And the patterns that we've seen recently are just different from what they've seen in the past. So I think my comment here would be that, our role as a public service center at the state climate office, we try to stick to what the science says. That means acknowledging things that we're not as certain about, like what the future of hurricanes looks like, but also try to connect that back with impacts that people are feeling. Again, one good example could be Hurricane Chantal from last summer. I think we saw the level of inland flooding from that event, and in some ways that was a teaching opportunity because we could go and talk to people about the increase in the frequency and intensity of these inland flooding events, have them tell us how that affected their community. Maybe the roads that they travel to work were closed, or maybe the parks that they go to visit are flooded, or maybe their own neighborhood had flooding and possibly at their own house as well. At the best, that was an inconvenience, and at the worst, that was a life upending experience. So I think that's a way to at least get people thinking about what these climate events are doing, maybe how those have changed over time. And there's an old saying about meeting people where they are. I think that's a good way to do it. You're not trying to force climate change on anybody, but if you can relate to what their personal lived experience is, that may be able to change the way they think
I
about some
haven't
of these
mentioned
things.
this to Michaela yet because she's moving to Tampa for graduate school. And I was reading a very in depth article the other night about how Tampa has avoided major hurricanes for a long time. And the speculation was, is Tampa overdue for a major hurricane hit?
It's funny, when I was an undergrad at NC State, this was 2005, a few months before Katrina hit. My freshman year meteorology professor said we all
Yes.
needed to watch New Orleans because they were overdue for a big storm. It
Right.
had been,
Yeah.
I think, since Camille in '69, since they had a major hurricanes. A couple months later, Katrina hit. So he also said, Dr. Weirden, what's the next area? He said, watch out for Tampa Bay. They had not seen one of those storms come in, especially right off the Gulf, in from the west. And we had a little bit of that with Ian and Milton, but that's still one of those areas that probably hasn't had as many big storms
Not
as
what you
maybe
want to
they've
hear,
been
right,
due for.
Michaela?
Yeah, because we got Milton and Helene basically back to back, and that was right after my parents moved down there. So, but
Yeah.
definitely not as big.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it's coming.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Corey, for taking the time to hop on today and chat with not only us, but the rest of the Elon community about the importance of understanding specific climate change impacts on North Carolina. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe, and always feel free to leave us an email with any feedback. Thank you so much.